Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon for those. I can see some folks joining in Singapore. So as Mohammed said, what I wanted to do was talk a little bit about how we're applying generative AI in enterprise service and process design within AstraZeneca and applying some of the concepts which Helen has discussed in her research. So just to explain a little bit my role, so I head up a group called Enterprise Planning, Analytics and AI within something we call the Axial program. I'm going to explain what that is in the context of AstraZeneca. And I guess we're approximately a year into starting to apply generative AI extensively within that program and within AstraZeneca. So a little bit about, I think we've got about 25 minutes, just a little bit about the topics I'm going to cover. So I'm going to very, very briefly give everyone a quick overview of who AstraZeneca is and what we do. I'm going to provide some context to the work we've been doing and the sort of joint research we've been doing with the Cambridge Service Alliance, talk to a few things about our experience with generative AI in process and service design, and then a couple of reflections, and then hopefully I think we'll have a little bit of time at the end to complete a Q&A. So just a little bit about AstraZeneca, for those who don't know us. So we are a research-led global pharmaceutical company. We're headquartered here in Cambridge in the UK. And we have sort of three fundamental areas of focus. One is cardiovascular, metabolic, and respiratory medicine. The second is oncology, which is the treatment of cancer. And then we have an important unit which looks at rare disease, so very rare diseases, which may affect 1 in a million or 1 in 10 million of the population. We're growing as a company. Last year we had 10% revenue growth, and our goal is to continue to grow over the next 5 years through new medicines and product launches. So we have three fundamental objectives at the moment, part of what we call our bold ambition for 2030. That's to bring 20 new medicines to market, and with some very important medicines in the area of cancer treatment and oncology. We want to be a leader in sustainable healthcare and achieve net zero by 20, not just within our internal operations, but also within our supply chain. And we want to grow to be approximately an 80 billion company by 2030, which will represent about a third growth on our current revenue in our last financial year, and effectively is doubling AstraZeneca's revenue over a period of 10 years. So I think the key characteristics of AstraZeneca is we're heavily research focused growing pharmaceutical company, which is scaling its business to support that growth. So with that in mind, approximately 3 years ago, we kicked off something we call the Axial program. The Axial program is an effort to redesign and simplify over 1,500 internal and external business processes within AstraZeneca across manufacturing, finance, and also our sales capabilities, so things like order to cash capabilities. So as mentioned, with 3 years into that program, it's underpinned by ERP technology, in our case, SAP. And so over the last 3 years, we've been looking at the sort of service design and blueprint of those 1,500 business processes and the corresponding underlying data which supports those processes. And I'll talk quite a lot when I talk about generative AI into the importance of data. The scope of the program is global, so it's concerning over 28 manufacturing sites, over 100 marketing companies, and all AstraZeneca locations. And our initial pilot market, which is Mexico, we're actually going live with in a couple of weeks with the new processes. So a major transformation program within AstraZeneca running over approximately 7 to 8 years, and representing about $2 billion of investment. So focusing much more on the research topic in terms of enterprise service design and the research and objectives we've been sharing with Helen and the CSA. I'm going to start in a sort of very high level, but essentially, when we look at service and process design and looking at those 1,500 processes we're currently redesigning, we sort of consider three fundamental elements. One is those areas which we need to differentiate as a company and where we need to truly innovate, recognizing that we don't need to differentiate and innovate in all areas of our business. We really need to just innovate and differentiate in those areas where we add the most value. A strong focus on standardization and standardizing our service design, recognizing that particularly in AstraZeneca, we've had a very fragmented structure historically, and we've tended not to standardize how our business operates, particularly when we look across regions and markets globally. And very important point to us because of our growth, which I discussed, is that when we design our services, they are truly scalable. So they don't just support our scale today, but they can support our scale in 2030. And in fact, in terms of the actual template, we're thinking much longer than that. So the joint research objective with the CSA has very much been understanding the roles and capabilities of generative AI in design for services. So how can we start to introduce generative AI as a capability in our design of business processes and services? And to sort of dive into that topic a little bit, it's probably good to reflect how we were doing this historically before we talk to how we've applied generative AI. And essentially, in a large enterprise like AstraZeneca, they're sort of pretty standard approaches we've used historically to designing our business processes and services. And typically, they've involved three things, which I've sort of called out in this deck. One is it's our intention to bring together our SMEs from across our company, from different business areas, and across geographies to get their input whenever we design a new service or capability. So we'll sort of reach across the organization, we'll look for those functional and geographic SMEs, and we'll bring their expertise to the center to design our future services and processes. Reflecting on that principle around standardization, and particularly because we don't need to differentiate everywhere, and specific to our current Axial program and our focus on ERP design, we have a strong emphasis on what we call fit to standard, which I think is a fairly broad term, namely that we're often looking for a best practice and simply adopting a good practice. We're not always looking to create something completely new. So a lot of our service frameworks, a lot of our design frameworks are very much around what's the established best practice, either within our industry or other industries. How do we align with that best practice? And particularly when we talk about ERP capabilities and technology and digital solutions, to minimize the level of customization with those solutions, how do we just adopt the standard service or process framework within them? And where do we want to customize that framework or enhance that framework to differentiate? And then, of course, like many organizations of our scale, we lean heavily on consulting services, specialist expertise, and that comes with it a significant cost. But typically, historically, we've brought our SMEs together, we've looked at best practice, and we've facilitated that process using strategic consulting and external support. And so underpinning those sort of processes where we bring SMEs together, we're obviously concerned with sort of a fundamental governance framework to support that. So we look at our overall design capabilities. We may have an SME who's very knowledgeable in a particular business process or service, but they may not be an expert in design. So we have to balance our capabilities between people who are sort of deep domain experts and people who are experts in enterprise process design. We have to, because we're a heavily regulated industry, think very carefully around controls, how we do our change control, around introducing any new service or process. And so there is a degree of governance that goes around any form of introduction of a new capability within our organization. And finally, and again, leaning to the fact we're a very heavily regulated industry, we have to generate a considerable amount of design output and documentation to support the design of any new service and process. So that includes everything from functional and technical designs used in the development of digital solutions to just documentation, training material, and other materials. And when I talk to how we've been using generative AI, a large focus has been on how generative AI can support us in that design output. So I'll keep going, and just sort of one final build on the framework before I get into the sort of detail of the generative AI. So as I mentioned at the beginning, we spent about a year ago, we started to sort of formalize our AI governance within the Axial program. And we've organized this governance and also working closely with one of Helen's colleagues, Gautam at CSA. And we sort of considered AI in two elements of the program. One is how we're using AI within the program as an accelerator for the program. And that's what I'm going to talk about today, how we've used generative AI in creating new service design and creating new process design. And the second element of our focus is how AI surfaces within the capabilities we're implementing. So how is AI surfacing within digital tools and enhancing the user experience of those digital tools? So I won't talk to that second part in terms of how AI is surfacing in the solution, but I will talk to a little bit how we're using generative AI in the transformation. And then we sort of developed three horizons in terms of our use of AI. What we can do practically immediately. So what's current, so how we can apply generative AI in our current work. What we see as near future or near-term opportunities, where we see, because of the pace which AI technologies are developing, where we can apply them in perhaps the next 6 to 12 months. And then also reflecting on longer term and more strategic opportunities. So perhaps where we see the technology at the end of our sort of Ambition 2030 journey. And we sort of organized our portfolio around those sort of three horizons. So just, I won't spend too long on the detail of this, but sort of how we've linked in with the research that Helen's been doing and the Cambridge Service Alliance. So really what we wanted to first do was think about, if we introduced AI or generative AI as an SME within or role within our service design, what are the strengths and what are the capabilities of generative AI which complement the roles of humans? And so the first discussions have been sort of, what are the strengths and the capabilities of humans? How do they approach a service design or a process design process? What are the strengths and capabilities of AI currently, and how does that complement humans, with the view that the starting point, and I'll talk to this in a few of our case studies, is thinking of generative AI as a co-worker, a new member of the team that joins the organization and brings a set of skills which augment the existing team. And then longer term, we talked about sort of the next horizon where AI could potentially replace the role of humans. But I think right now what we're really sort of looking at is how it can act as an accelerator and how it can complement the skills within the organization. So bearing in mind sort of the potential and where AI strengths are, working alongside a sort of traditional human SMEs, we then asked sort of three fundamental questions as we thought about our adoption of generative AI. So the first, which I've already mentioned, is how can AI augment our SMEs in the design roles? How can it complement them? How's that concept of a digital co-worker or a digital AI colleague actually going to work within the design process? And then finally, based on our experience using AI, can AI eventually make effective, trustworthy design decisions and potentially achieve that autonomy that we truly trust AI to take the decision on our behalf? But I would emphasize at the moment, it's very much on a co-worker where we validate the AI outputs, but where we see that those are effective over time, we can think of AI replacing some of our SMEs roles. The underlying challenges we identified at the beginning, and I think I'll really focus on this also in my conclusions, is that in order to effectively apply generative AI, particularly in a business or enterprise setting, foundational data quality is extremely important, and it significantly impacts the AI effectiveness. I think most folks are very impressed and sort of delighted by the capabilities of AI in the real world in terms of its ability to sort of help us solve problems and help us generate content. But it's trained on a sort of vast amount of supportive content available on the internet. When you bring AI into the enterprise, it needs to be trained on your data, on your semantic models, and really understand what your business is doing. And without that training, it often cannot be effective. So the first sort of fundamental challenge we knew was data quality. The second was around adoption, which, and I think Helen mentioned it right at the beginning, less whether generative AI is technically capable, but more around the barriers and enablers for SMEs and employees to use it, and it genuinely increased their productivity. And then finally, and I think the final element is about AI's decision-making abilities, is how much we trust the AI outcomes, and what are the accountability frameworks. So if AI is helping us make decisions within the organization, if AI is making design decisions, how does that change our governance frameworks in terms of accountability and compliance? And that obviously in a pharmaceutical company with our regulatory environment is particularly important. So with that in mind, I'm going to talk to a couple of examples of the application of AI within the Axial program. I would emphasize, in terms of the complexity of use of generative AI, these are relatively simple. But I think the important thing, and why it's important to the learnings, is they were applied at scale. And I think it's, on one thing, it's organizations generally have been very effective in pilots of demonstrating sophistication with AI when applied with individual users or in sort of small pilots. But I suppose the fundamental challenge for most large enterprises, including ourselves, is how do we adopt AI at scale across the organization? So I'm starting with a very simple example, but actually proved to be a very effective use of generative AI. And just coming back to that sort of original context to what we're doing within this program. So I mentioned we're designing a considerable number of new business processes and new business services. And one of the design outputs of all those business processes, sort of executed by quite a large team, a team of over 200 SMEs, at one point up to 500 SMEs across the company, was we generated well over 5,000 user stories, which described our sort of future service functional requirements in some detail. But one of the challenges we had when we undertook such a large design exercise at scale is that when you sort of deliver output across more than 200 SMEs, you get considerable inconsistencies in the way that output is authored. You get some degree of duplication because actually within individual business processes, there are common requirements. And importantly, I mentioned that some of those SMEs may or may not have expertise in service design, and that will also affect the quality of how they author and document their outputs. So coming out of a large design process where we look at all these different processes, what we found in a critical review is that of the many user stories we generated, some were incomplete, there was inconsistencies across them, and in some cases there was duplication. So how do we apply generative AI? Well, what we did is we generated an AI agent which essentially evaluated all our design outputs in terms of our user stories against some structured criteria and scored them for quality and efficacy, and also against the compliance criteria in terms of meeting, in our industry, SOX, which is a financial requirement, and GXP, which stands for Good Manufacturing Practices or Good Practices within pharmaceuticals. And we analyzed all these stories and identified, and the generative AI agent was set with the task of identifying those that needed improvement, which did not follow a consistent structure, and therefore were flagged for improvement to the SME who had generated that specific content. So the impact of doing that, I'll show you a little bit of a screenshot of how the generative AI agent fed that back. But our goals were essentially to improve the consistency of quality across a large-scale design process. So though we're working across 200 SMEs, make sure that our design outputs were consistent across that entire group. To drive some efficiency, so historically when we would do these quality assurance exercises, we would have done them through manual audit, probably through human review, and that's extremely time-consuming when you look at the scale. What we saw is considerable efficiency, that the AI agent was able to evaluate in a very short period of time the entirety of design output and provide, as I'll show on the next screen, clear actionable inputs. And then finally, as I mentioned, would satisfy our compliance criteria within the industry, where that's very clearly documented how we have to frame our design and outputs against those GXP and SOX criteria. So just very briefly to show you the output from the agent. So what we did is, so we evaluated these 5,000 user stories, and essentially we looked at two dimensions. So one was some recommendations coming from generative AI on improvement to their phrasing and accuracy based on those predefined structured criteria. So what we would say is, maybe a user story service design criteria has an unclear customer or unclear role. So we say all user stories have to have a very clear role within the organization, and they have to have a very clear outcome. And what the AI was able to do was analyze them and show where they missed that clear structure, and make some practical suggestions about how the user story could be improved to meet the quality criteria. And the second part of the assessment, in terms of the sort of actionable input on the actual user story itself, was it also considered how effectively that design input could be used further down the process in a generative design process. So we assessed the effectiveness of our design outputs for use with generative AI in the next stage of the process. And it again made some recommendations of how we could improve our foundational data quality to improve how the design outputs could be used in generative solutions. And that was really important because, as I mentioned at the beginning, the data foundation that supports our use of generative AI is probably the biggest challenge we have right now. So very successful process. tremendous sort of efficacy and efficiency in the use of a generative AI agent. Quite a simple example, but able to be deployed at scale and therefore very well received by the user base. So moving on quickly, so we then took this generative approach and we then sort of looked a little bit downstream of the design process. So we went from user story into, I suppose, more complex design out and service design output. So things like test scripts for testing services, actual operating procedures and user instructions, training materials. And these again tend to be sort of archetypes and outputs which put a significant demand on SMEs when you're designing services and processes in an enterprise. And in our case, we're potentially a huge program bottleneck given the scale at which we were operating. So in this case, we used a generative AI agent to synthesize more complex documentation and outputs. I'll just simplistically call it documentations. And so therefore, rather than looking at a single source like a user story, it was combining multiple sources. So business process flows, business process diagrams, user stories, data design standards, and other design outputs to generate more complex procedures. So either operating procedures, as I mentioned, test scripts, or training material. Now, with this additional complexity was when we started to sort of really test the capabilities of our generative AI agents. And of course, as I think many of you will know, the generative AI immediately created what we would call coherent documents. So they were clearly written, they were clearly structured. And so in terms of the quality of the output, in terms of their ability to be reviewed by end users, they were very good. But because we were using generative AI over a number of different data sources, we started to see errors introduced into this document, and we did see some elements of hallucination, misunderstanding of more complex business process flows, and the introduction of, or perhaps the incorrect application of data in the context. And so that led that when the SMEs reviewed this generative AI output, it led to substantial correction. And so we got into a much more detailed process with our SMEs that they needed to review the AI output or generative AI in more depth, make recommendations. And that led to understandable some rejection by SMEs and frustration that generative AI wasn't sort of delivering productivity improvements and efficacies. And so that there we were very much into a sort of a change impact of ensuring that we work closely with users to make sure we were putting their feedback into the improvements of the generative AI model. And one of the things they struggled with was how do I actually improve my input source data quality? They understood how to do it for the user stories in the previous examples I gave, but some of the other data archetypes which the generative AI was using were more difficult to correct. Now, I would say, so this was immediately a challenge. There was some rejection of use of the generative AI agents, but where we persevered with specific SMEs and individuals, we did get to much better outcomes. But the learning from the processes, it was an iterative process. The initial results were relatively poor, with significant focus on the source data and taking the feedback from SMEs. The generative agent has improved to the extent that right now we are able to generate much more complex design outputs and documentation using generative agents. And I realize I'm up at the hour, so I'll be very, very brief. But I suppose the third horizon, or where we want to take this next. So I gave two examples where we're using generative AI in a specific process step in design. So I mentioned user stories as an important output in service design, and also some of the kind of downstream documentation. At this point within AstraZeneca, we haven't applied generative AI or agentic solutions in end-to-end design, but we're very interested in their potential. So most of our focus has actually been on training our leaders and training our organization in the opportunities around that generative AI. And so we've been running sort of management exercises to develop concepts and brands using generative AI, which may not be specific to our industry, but we've really been reflecting on the learnings of the group using that. And so we recently ran an exercise with over 200 leaders where we used generative AI to develop a consumer product based on simply on some consumer brand market trend data. And they were encouraged to use a number of LLMs. I think most of us focused on ChatGPT. And then we did a group exercise to reflect on what were our learnings and what did we understand from having completed that exercise. And I would just call that sort of two fundamental learnings. So I think everyone was incredibly impressed about the capabilities of AI to develop a full product concept in a relatively short period of time in an area that we may not individually have significant expertise. So almost all groups were able to go from their source market trend data to the full product concept in a matter of hours and executed by very small teams, typically working teams of 2 and 3 people. But almost all of the group reflected that the use of generative AI fundamentally changed our sense of ownership of the design outputs. And the two things that were called out is one, that when generative AI was introduced, there was felt to be less ownership of the design. It was felt that, it's not my idea so much if it's come from generative AI. And so people openly talked about how their relationship with the output and how their sense of ownership of the output had changed when they used generative AI in the exercise. And they also acknowledged that how they appraised output when it came from generative AI appeared to be different how they would appraise output generated by their teams or by humans. And by that, what we mean is we tended to assume AI was correct, and that we had to sort of challenge ourselves to critically evaluate its output. We assumed it to be correct, whereas most of the managers reflected that if that output had been generated by their sort of quote unquote human team, they would probably have been more critical in their judgment of its outcomes. But I think learning for us, very useful exercise to start to think about how generative AI could be used end to end in service design, and obviously, or product design. And obviously, the next step is to start to apply that in, I would say, real pharmaceutical examples. So I realize I'm up against the hour, so I'll just wrap up. So Helen mentioned in her presentation and referred to some principles, the design principles she's put together. We found this framework extremely useful, and we tried to apply some of these design principles in our thinking, particularly around the setup of governance. So I won't walk through all of these today, but I think it would be very valuable for this group to review those. Behind each of them, the CSA and Helen's research has gone into much more detail, much more specific examples of how an organization might implement and apply each of these design principles. In terms of AstraZeneca, I'll just sort of make a few reflections on design principles that we've applied and kind of our learnings from them. So, and this will sort of be the close of my presentation. So, I think the thing I'll keep on emphasize early in the presentation is generative AI can only be effective in enterprise if your foundational data quality is of a high standard and you have what we might call AI-ready data. So that means having data products, having clear data definitions, and having made some effort to train your semantic layer within your organization so AI can meaningfully interpret your design inputs. And so as an enterprise, we are investing very heavily, and I think this is our main focus at this size, of improving our input data quality, data products, and our semantic layer to support the opportunity of generative AI. That's kind of the fundamental challenge we're tackling right now. And then once we've sort of made that investment, we do see huge opportunity in generative AI in service and process design. And we want to build to more sophisticated sort of end-to-end applications and get to that sort of true end state where generative AI is taking fully the traditional role of SMEs. So I think those are sort of the key things we learned in AstraZeneca. In terms of the design principles frameworks, obviously that requires a consideration of how human judgment and AI capability interact within the organization. I think we made some good progress there. We've had to think very carefully about our exploratory design principles, where we want to apply guardrails and data, and how we critically evaluate the output of generative AI-led design. And then obviously, we've had to share that learning across the organization. So I mentioned it's possible to achieve success with individuals, and people are very proficient in their individual use. But to apply these technologies at scale is really the challenge and drive those change goals. And then hopefully I've shown you that we've already embedded some fundamental governance frameworks in how we adopt AI within the organization. We continue to scale them. And then also, very importantly, we're very aware, and that's part of our partnership with the CSA, but more broadly, that we need the support of external partners and experts to support this AI ecosystem. So we don't have all the expertise we need internally. We are actively working externally to learn and learn from new research in generative AI. And I think particularly in generative AI, the traditional sort of consulting paths for large organization are not necessarily generating the outcomes we would hope. We're getting much more benefit from collaborating, not just with university research groups, but also small startup companies. Organizations really at the sort of cutting edge of this technology tend to be where we get the most learnings. So I realized I ran a little bit over my slot, but I hope that was useful for the group, and thank you. And I think we've just got a few minutes for questions.